There's a very specific moment that undoes an avoidant faster than almost anything else they'll ever encounter, and it has nothing to do with confrontation, nothing to do with anger, and nothing to do with anything the avoidant themselves ever consciously planned for. It's the moment they see, with their own eyes or through secondhand information that might as well be their own eyes, that the person they once had access to is now being loved, openly and visibly, by someone else. Not simply moved on from them in the abstract, actually loved actively by another person in ways that used to belong, at least in theory, to them. This moment detonates something specific inside an avoidant psychology that silence alone rarely reaches, that distance alone rarely triggers, and that even genuine, hard-won peace, as significant as that peace is, doesn't always manage to activate quite this intensely or quite this fast. What follows is an explanation of exactly why this particular trigger lands so differently, why an avoidance composure can crack so visibly under circumstances that seem, on the surface, considerably less dramatic than a breakup or an argument ever was, and what that cracking actually reveals about the psychology underneath their usual guarded exterior. Anyone listening who has witnessed an avoidant partner or former partner respond with startling, almost unrecognizable intensity to news of a new relationship deserves an explanation for why that specific reaction happened and why it says something considerably more complicated than simple continued love or lingering attachment alone. It's worth naming before going further why this particular topic deserves careful, dedicated attention rather than being folded into general explanations of avoidant jealousy or heartbreak. This specific trigger, visible evidence of active romantic replacement rather than simply absence or distance, produces a psychological reaction distinct enough in both intensity and underlying mechanism that it warrants its own separate examination. Treating it as simply an extension of ordinary avoidant jealousy tends to obscure exactly the kind of nuance this exploration is trying to bring into clearer focus. Nuance that matters enormously for anyone trying to make sense of a reaction that otherwise seems disproportionate, confusing, or even alarming compared to everything else witnessed throughout the relationship's earlier history. To understand why this particular trigger produces such an outsized response, it helps to separate two things that get routinely confused whenever this topic comes up: ongoing romantic love and territorial possessiveness. These two experiences can certainly coexist, and they often do, but they are not the same psychological process, and understanding the difference is essential to making sense of what actually happens inside an avoidant when they witness someone they once had access to being loved openly by someone new. It's worth naming, too, why this confusion between love and possessiveness happens so consistently in popular conversation about this topic, since recognizing the source of that confusion helps explain why so many people mistakenly treat an avoidance intense reaction as straightforward proof of romantic devotion. Possessiveness and love often travel together in ordinary, healthy relationships, making it easy to assume that wherever one appears, the other must be present as well. This assumption holds up reasonably well in most contexts, which is precisely why it gets applied so automatically here too, even though, as this exploration will demonstrate, the specific combination of factors driving an avoidance reaction makes this particular assumption considerably less reliable than it would be in most other relational contexts. Ordinary heartbreak, the kind that follows a breakup regardless of who initiated it, tends to center around loss, grief for what existed, sadness about what's now absent, sometimes genuine longing for reconciliation. This kind of heartbreak, while painful, tends to unfold along a relatively predictable emotional trajectory, easing gradually as time passes and as new routines and experiences fill the space the relationship used to occupy. Witnessing an ex move on to someone new can certainly intensify this kind of ordinary heartbreak temporarily, but it doesn't usually produce anything qualitatively different from what was already being experienced. It simply adds another layer of difficulty to an already familiar grieving process. What's being described throughout this exploration is something different, a distinct psychological reaction that activates specifically and sometimes almost exclusively in response to visible evidence of someone else's romantic access to a person the avoidant once had access to themselves. This reaction draws on considerably older, more primitive psychological material than ordinary grief does, material connected to status, territory, and self-concept, rather than simply to attachment and loss. Understanding this distinction explains why an avoidant can seem relatively composed throughout an entire breakup and its aftermath, only to unravel dramatically the moment concrete evidence of a new romantic connection enters their awareness, a sequence that would make very little sense if this reaction were simply an extension of ordinary heartbreak. This territorial dimension deserves careful, honest examination because it explains behavior that otherwise seems contradictory or even hypocritical. It's worth acknowledging too how disorienting it can be to witness this contradiction firsthand, someone who withheld consistency and presence throughout an entire relationship suddenly, visibly struggling upon learning that someone else has stepped into the space they themselves left mostly unattended. This disorientation is a completely reasonable response to a genuinely confusing sequence of events, and anyone who has felt frustrated, even angry, watching this contradiction play out, deserves to have that frustration acknowledged as valid rather than immediately smoothed over by psychological explanation alone. Understanding why something happens doesn't require pretending it wasn't also simultaneously difficult, unfair, or frustrating to witness. An avoidant who showed minimal interest in maintaining or deepening the relationship while it existed, who created distance, withheld consistency, and generally behaved as though the relationship carried relatively low priority in their life, can still experience a genuinely visceral, disproportionate reaction upon learning that someone else has claimed the space they themselves declined to fully occupy. This isn't hypocrisy exactly, though it can certainly look that way from the outside. It reflects something more specific about how human psychology, and particularly avoidant psychology, tends to process status and exclusivity separately from active desire or genuine ongoing investment. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who owns a large, mostly unused piece of property, land they rarely visit, invest in, or particularly value in any active sense, treating it more as a background fact of their life than as something requiring ongoing attention or care. This same person, upon learning that someone else has begun actively cultivating that exact piece of land, building something meaningful on it, tending to it with genuine care and attention, often experiences a sudden, intense reaction entirely disproportionate to how much they themselves ever actually used or valued the property while it was solely theirs. This reaction isn't really about the land's practical value. It's about a sudden confrontation with loss of exclusive claim, a jolt that has more to do with ownership and status than with any genuine active desire to use or develop the property themselves. This dynamic, uncomfortable as it is to name plainly, captures something genuinely important about why avoidants react so intensely to this particular trigger, even in relationships where their own active investment was minimal throughout. It's worth being honest about how uncomfortable this particular truth can be to sit with, especially for anyone who spent a relationship hoping that eventual visible evidence of jealousy might confirm deeper feeling than the avoidant ever demonstrated directly. The territorial reaction being described here doesn't necessarily confirm the kind of deep, sustained romantic love someone might hope it reflects. It can exist, and often does exist, as a largely separate psychological process, rooted more in loss of exclusive access and status than in genuine, ongoing romantic investment. This doesn't mean genuine feeling was never present, only that this particular reaction, on its own, isn't reliable evidence of it, and shouldn't be interpreted as confirmation of depth simply because it appears intensely and visibly. There's a second related dimension worth exploring, one that goes beyond simple territoriality into something closer to identity threat, and it explains why this trigger can produce reactions considerably more intense and more destabilizing than territorial possessiveness alone would predict. For many avoidants, their entire relational history has been built around maintaining a specific self-concept, someone who remains in control, someone who determines the terms and timing of closeness and distance, someone whose emotional availability is offered, when it's offered at all, on their own schedule rather than in response to external pressure or demand. Witnessing evidence that someone they once had access to has moved forward fully and visibly into a new relationship without requiring the avoidant's continued involvement, presence, or even acknowledgement directly threatens this specific self-concept. It suggests uncomfortably that the avoidant's own timeline, their own careful management of closeness and distance, their own assumption that they retained some degree of control over how and when this particular connection would ultimately resolve, was never actually as significant or as controlling as they'd assumed. Someone else simply moved forward on their own timeline without waiting for the avoidant's permission, acknowledgement, or eventual readiness. And this can feel, to an avoidant's deeply protected sense of control, like a genuine identity rupture rather than simply an emotional disappointment. This explains why the specific reaction being described throughout this exploration often carries a quality distinct from ordinary jealousy or heartbreak, something closer to genuine disorientation, a shaken sense of self rather than simply sadness about a lost relationship. An avoidant experiencing this particular trigger isn't just grieving a person. They're confronting evidence that their own carefully maintained sense of control and timing, central to how they've organized their entire relational life, doesn't actually hold the influence over other people's lives that they'd unconsciously assumed it did. There's a metaphor worth holding here as well. Picture someone who has spent years believing themselves to be the conductor of an orchestra, assuming that every musician's timing depended entirely on their own cues and direction. Then imagine this same person discovering, suddenly and without warning, that the orchestra has been playing beautifully without them for quite some time, following someone else's direction entirely, producing music that clearly doesn't require their presence or permission at all. The disorientation in this discovery isn't really about the music itself. It's about a fundamental confrontation with how much actual control the conductor never really had in the first place, a confrontation considerably more destabilizing than simply losing an audience or a performance opportunity would be on its own. It's worth naming what this specific combination, territorial loss alongside identity threat, actually tends to produce behaviorally, because the resulting pattern often looks genuinely erratic, sometimes alarmingly so compared to how composed and controlled an avoidant typically presents in most other circumstances. It helps to describe some of these behaviors with more specificity, because the abstract description of erratic behavior can be difficult to recognize without something more concrete attached to it. One common manifestation involves a sudden, uncharacteristic increase in monitoring behavior, checking for updates or information about the new relationship far more frequently than would be expected from someone who claims or has demonstrated through prior behavior relative indifference to the situation. This monitoring often happens quietly, without any direct acknowledgement, but it tends to produce visible downstream effects, unexpected comments revealing knowledge the avoidant shouldn't logically have, questions phrased in ways that suggest more familiarity with the new relationship's details than casual interest would explain. Another common manifestation involves a sudden re-emergence of self-improvement behavior timed suspiciously close to learning about the new relationship, changes to appearance, sudden new hobbies or pursuits, an uptick in visible achievement or success shared more publicly than usual. This pattern reflects the identity threat dimension discussed earlier, an attempt to reassert relevance and desirability specifically in response to feeling that relevance has been directly, visibly challenged by someone else's successful romantic advancement. A further manifestation involves behavior directed not at the ex-partner specifically, but at people in their shared social circle. An uptick in reaching out to mutual friends or family members, sometimes under the guise of unrelated conversation, but often carrying an unspoken subtext, clearly oriented around gathering information or maintaining some form of continued presence within the ex-partner's broader life and awareness. This particular behavior often confuses people receiving it, since it doesn't involve direct contact with the ex-partner at all, but it tends to serve the same underlying territorial function, an attempt to remain relevant and present within a shared world the avoidant senses is moving forward without them. A final manifestation worth naming involves emotional volatility that spills into unrelated areas of the avoidant's life, increased irritability at work, uncharacteristic conflict with friends or family, a general decline in emotional regulation that seems disconnected on the surface from anything happening within their own immediate circumstances. This spillover reflects the genuine intensity of the underlying reaction, difficult to fully contain within a single, isolated area of life once it's been triggered this significantly, leaking instead into contexts that have nothing directly to do with the relationship or the person that originally triggered it. This reaction frequently produces a sudden, uncharacteristic re-emergence of contact, reaching out after prolonged silence, sometimes with little coherent explanation, offered for why now specifically, after so much prior distance. It can produce sudden, unexpected displays of retroactive investment, referencing the relationship with newfound significance or regret that stands in stark contrast to how it was actually treated while it existed. It can also produce behaviour aimed less directly at the person themselves and more at reasserting some sense of relevance or presence, increased visibility in shared social circles, subtle attempts to remain in view or in awareness without any explicit acknowledgement of what's actually motivating this shift in behaviour. There's a deeper psychological grounding worth explaining here, because it helps clarify why this particular trigger operates with such force and such consistency across so many different avoidant individuals, rather than this pattern being some kind of unusual, isolated quirk. Human psychology generally carries deeply ingrained mechanisms related to mate retention and perceived romantic competition. Mechanisms that operate largely automatically and that predate conscious, deliberate reasoning by a considerable margin. These mechanisms evolved to respond specifically to signals of romantic competition and loss of exclusive access, triggering heightened arousal, vigilance, and motivation to reassert relevance, regardless of how much active, conscious investment a person was actually making in a particular relationship beforehand. This means the intensity of the reaction being described throughout this exploration isn't simply a matter of individual avoidant psychology operating in isolation. It draws on considerably older, more universal psychological machinery that exists in some form across most people generally, but that interacts in a particularly complicated, amplified way with an avoidant's specific defense structure and identity organization. For someone whose entire sense of control and self-concept depends heavily on managing the terms of closeness and distance, this deeply ingrained competitive mechanism doesn't simply produce ordinary jealousy. It produces jealousy layered on top of genuine identity destabilization, a considerably more intense and disorienting combination than either factor alone would typically generate. This grounding also helps explain why this particular reaction can appear even in avoidants who demonstrated minimal active investment throughout the relationship itself, since these mate retention mechanisms don't actually require active conscious desire in order to activate. They respond primarily to signals of competition and loss of exclusive status, signals that can trigger a genuine, visceral reaction, independent of how much an avoidant actually wanted, valued, or invested in maintaining that exclusive status while they still held it. There's a physiological dimension worth naming as well, because this particular trigger tends to produce a fairly distinct, recognizable bodily signature, one that helps explain why the resulting behavior often feels so disproportionate and so difficult for the avoidant themselves to fully control or rationalize away. Evidence of romantic competition tends to activate a genuine stress and arousal response, elevated heart rate, disrupted sleep, a restless, agitated quality that mirrors acute anxiety more closely than it mirrors ordinary sadness or disappointment. This physiological activation helps explain why the resulting behavior often looks impulsive and poorly regulated, quite different from the careful, controlled composure an avoidant typically maintains across most other areas of their life. The body, in this specific circumstance, is responding to something it interprets as a genuine, urgent threat, and that physiological urgency tends to override the more careful, deliberate self-management an avoidant usually relies on to maintain their composed, guarded exterior. This pattern often confuses and sometimes deeply hurts the person receiving it, particularly if it arrives at a moment when they've genuinely, successfully moved forward into something new and meaningful. It can feel, understandably, like the avoidant only values what they can no longer easily access, confirmation of exactly the kind of frustrating, backwards logic that so often characterizes avoidant relational patterns throughout their entire history. This perception isn't wrong, exactly, but it deserves the more complete psychological context this exploration has been building throughout, because understanding why this specific mechanism operates the way it does offers considerably more clarity than simply labeling the behavior frustrating or hypocritical without examining its underlying structure. There's something worth addressing directly here, because it explains a distinction that shapes how this entire reaction unfolds depending on the specific circumstances surrounding the original relationship's ending. This reaction tends to manifest somewhat differently depending on whether the avoidant was the one who initiated the breakup, or whether they were the one left behind. And understanding this distinction helps clarify why the same underlying trigger can produce noticeably different intensities and textures of response, depending on the specific history involved. When an avoidant was the one who initiated the ending, often through gradual withdrawal rather than any single decisive conversation, witnessing evidence of a new relationship tends to activate the territorial and identity-based mechanisms already described, but often layered with an additional element of surprise, an unconscious assumption that their own choice to create distance somehow preserved an implicit option to return whenever they eventually felt ready. Discovering that this implicit option no longer exists, that someone else has claimed the space the avoidant assumed would remain available indefinitely, tends to produce a particularly sharp, disorienting version of this reaction, precisely because it contradicts an assumption the avoidant likely never even recognized they were making until it was directly, undeniably violated. When an avoidant was instead the one left behind, having already experienced some version of the spiraling and reckoning discussed in other explorations of this topic, witnessing evidence of a new relationship tends to compound whatever unresolved grief and identity confrontation was already underway, intensifying an existing process rather than introducing an entirely new shock. This version of the reaction often carries a somewhat different texture, less pure surprise, and more a kind of accelerated, intensified version of grief and reckoning that was likely already in progress to some degree, now sharpened considerably by concrete, undeniable evidence that the relationship's ending has become permanent and irreversible in a way that remained more ambiguous or theoretical beforehand. Both versions of this reaction, though textured somewhat differently depending on this underlying history, ultimately draw on the same core psychological material already explored throughout this piece: territorial loss and identity threat, simply arriving through slightly different pathways depending on who held the initial decision-making power when the relationship actually ended. It's important here to address something that deserves direct, unambiguous attention, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misread as suggesting that a new relationship should somehow be paused, hidden, or managed carefully in order to avoid triggering this particular reaction in an avoidant ex-partner. This would be a serious misapplication of everything being explained here. Nobody building a new, meaningful connection owes an ex-partner, avoidant or otherwise, any consideration regarding how visible or public that new connection becomes. The reaction being described throughout this exploration belongs entirely to the avoidant experiencing it, a consequence of their own unresolved psychological material regarding territory, control, and identity, not a signal that anyone else did something wrong or inconsiderate by simply living their life forward. This distinction matters enormously because there's a real risk, particularly for anyone who spent a long relationship accommodating an avoidant partner's comfort and timeline, of unconsciously continuing that same accommodation even after the relationship has ended, softening or managing a new relationship's visibility out of some lingering, misplaced concern for how it might affect someone who, throughout the actual relationship, rarely extended the same consideration in return. This pattern deserves to be named and interrupted directly. A new, healthy relationship deserves to be lived fully and visibly, without regard for how an ex-partner's unresolved territorial or identity-based reactions might be affected by that visibility. There's an important caution worth naming here, because not every dramatic reaction from an avoidant ex-partner upon learning about a new relationship reflects the genuine, involuntary psychological process described throughout this exploration. Some reactions are considerably more performed than genuine, deliberate attempts to reintroduce doubt or guilt, timed strategically rather than arising spontaneously from authentic internal distress. Distinguishing between these two possibilities matters enormously for anyone trying to understand what a particular reaction actually means. Genuine reactions of the kind described throughout this piece tend to carry a certain rawness and inconsistency, difficulty maintaining composure, contradictory statements, behavior that seems to surprise the avoidant themselves as much as it surprises anyone witnessing it. Performed reactions, by contrast, tend to carry a more polished, purposeful quality, arriving with unusually clear, well-articulated language about feelings that would otherwise seem foreign to someone with genuinely limited emotional vocabulary throughout the rest of the relationship, or timed suspiciously precisely around moments most likely to produce maximum disruption to the new relationship currently being built. This distinction matters because a performed reaction deserves an entirely different response than a genuine one. A genuine reaction, as this exploration has emphasized throughout, still doesn't obligate anyone to pause, reconsider, or manage their own new relationship's visibility. But a performed reaction deserves this same firm boundary, offered with additional clarity regarding what's actually happening, an attempt at manipulation rather than an authentic psychological process, one that deserves to be recognized and firmly, calmly declined rather than engaged with as though it carried the same weight as genuine, involuntary distress. Everything explored throughout this piece describes a reaction that occurs naturally, as an unintended byproduct of someone genuinely, healthily moving forward into a new connection. This is an entirely different thing from deliberately entering or publicizing a new relationship specifically in order to provoke this reaction in an avoidant ex-partner, using a new connection primarily as a tool for producing jealousy or regret, rather than as something valued and pursued for its own genuine merit.